where do we as humans sort of lie in this space? Like, of course, there are people in power that have contributed and exacerbated a lot of these issues, but just us as humans, what is our role in the ecosystem? Where do we need to go from here? We do know that the end result is going to be quite tragic and a lot of damage has been done. But then where is the hope in this work?
Welcome to the Kreashon podcast. I am your host, Mana Rock of Kray, and I have with me today Agrita. I don't know if I'm putting the accent correctly.
It's perfect. It's really cute. I love it.
And you are from the Mindful of Everything podcast, where I got to be a guest 2 times now. And I really like your podcast, and I think we have similar background in that we studied something in the realms of like international development and environmentalism. Is then more your side of things. Obviously, the environmentalism is somewhere within the international development, which is what I studied. And I think we're really connected on that we have that study background, but that we some way, somehow got like a more holistic view of things. And yeah, I think that's where we really connect. But I'll let you tell a little bit more about that yourself. So I will start by asking you, first of all, welcome. And who are you and what do you do?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to your space. You don't often get that opportunity as a host of a podcast to, be given that space to put forward a story. So thank you so much, first of all, for holding that space for me today. Who am I? And what I do is a very big question. So I think I'll start off with my profession. I am currently working in a conservation charity that regrants philanthropic funds to locally led initiatives. So I began 3 months ago. So I'm quite new to the organization and to the work that they do. I'm a program officer, so I help with grant admin for some of the programs that are looking at overlooked species and ecosystems. And we are predominantly working in the global south, which do have there's a big funding gap there. So I feel really, really aligned to the work. And it wasn't something that I was expecting to go into. I have to say, when you do graduate, sometimes you feel like the environmental sector is quite specialized. But then when you actually look into it, there's so many different areas you can sort of specialize in and look into. So yeah, this job was quite unexpected when the year began. I was not expecting to be where I am now. So I'm very grateful for that. In terms of my qualifications, I have a master's in environmental and social policy and also a bachelor's in environmental science. So as you mentioned at the beginning, our sort of work is very aligned. I've always been in the environmental space, and I knew that this was a space that not only aligned to my professional values, but also personal. And so I just knew I was going to be here. How it would look like, I didn't know. And I think it was in the 3rd year of my undergraduate studies where I could sort of see a massive gap in environmental science and conservation science. And that was that there's a bit of a separation between the personal and the scientific. And when I went into, for instance, the environmental science degree, it was not something that I was thinking that, I would actually look into and realize that this is a gap. For me, if it's science, right? So it's either like lab studies or field work. It's very much Western, like a Western scientific framework. And I didn't really think I would be questioning that or challenging that in any way within the institution. But third year, when I started becoming a bit more interested in policy work, I could see that there was that massive gap, right? Where is the work on consciousness? Where is the work and really looking into yourself and asking, well, okay, we can talk about these concepts and we can talk about these different frameworks to address issues at hand. But where do we as humans sort of lie in this space? Like, of course, there are people in power that have contributed and exacerbated a lot of these issues, but just us as humans, what is our role in the ecosystem? Where do we need to go from here? We do know that the end result is going to be quite tragic and a lot of damage has been done. But then where is the hope in this work? So that really emotional and personal dimension, I just wasn't finding. And so that's when I decided I wanted to do a master's. And I do feel very grateful, and I do want to express that gratitude for the course introducing me to different policy frameworks, for instance, rights of nature, really bringing forward those alternative knowledge systems that Indigenous and local communities have been safeguarding for generations. It was really good in terms of becoming familiar with that knowledge and to relearn that knowledge. But I still feel like the work was quite surface level. You just talk about these concepts, you talk about some of the work, and that's pretty much it. And for people living in the UK, of course, UK environmental policy is very top down. It's very much informed by conventional science, science that can be peer reviewed, science that is seen as like the ultimate sort of knowledge. Without that, the work that you do it can't be sort of verified, right? It can't be quantified if you're talking about alternative knowledges. So, yeah, I feel like the master's was a great place for me to see how the personal and the professional can come together, how stories and scientific practice can also come together. It didn't provide me with the necessary tools to do so, but I do feel that the job that I'm doing right now is allowing me to put that into practice in some way. Of course, it's an entry-level job. It's my first ever full-time job. I'm quite new to the full-time working world, which is really exciting. At the same time, you sort of see, well, how do you balance the work and, your work life and your personal life? And it has only been 3 months, but I feel like now I can see how those two bodies of work can be interwoven. Yeah. And so I'm very grateful for that. But this is a journey that is lifelong, right? Whilst living in a Western culture so far away from my birthland, it can seem quite challenging. Mm-hmm. But I feel that the stories of our partners who are literally on the front lines, are on the ground, doing all of the work that we do need for our ecosystems. So I can see that, but I feel like there is still a long way to go. And there is that limitation of being in a space and being in a place where some of these concepts are still quite new, even though they are age old. Yeah. It's quite difficult to say exactly who I am, where I am right now, but I think that would be a good way to begin.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And you said a lot of interesting things that I was like, okay, no, but let her speak first.
Thank you.
But, so I was interested in, wait, let me write down because I'm going to start with one and forget the other one.
I love that. Yeah.
Okay, so a couple of things stuck with me. first of all, so to go back a little bit about what it is you're doing now. You said about overlooked species conservation. What is this overlooked species in the UK? Okay, so in the UK.
No, actually, no. So our work it expands across the world, but we're particularly looking at countries that have a massive conservation funding gap. So those are mostly in the global south, for instance. That term in itself is, there's quite a lot of challenges in saying that. I don't think I'm completely comfortable with that. Yeah. But for now, we do focus, like, for instance, South America, some African countries, and Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, where, the socio-political context is extremely challenging, and a lot of work that has been done for conservation, you either can't name it as such, or you just have very limited funding. And then if you have international funds coming in to some of these community-led initiatives, the sort of challenges between communities that can happen that, this community is getting international funding. So there's a lot to think about when you are funding overseas. We do have some partners that are in the UK, but predominantly we are focusing on the global south.
yeah. And what should I imagine when you say an overlooked species? Like, what is that? what are we talking about?
Yeah, so we do have, for instance, mammals, fishes. Plants are actually probably like the category that is very, very overlooked in terms of individual plant species. But I guess when we talk about species conservation, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is elephants, right? Orangutans. The sort of keystone species that, WWF is very famous for sort of putting that across. Adopt an animal, exactly, the panda. So we are looking at those species that perhaps are less charismatic, again, in quotes. The species where a lot of research is not being done and how to protect them, what their current status is. So we have like the IUCN red lists and, those sort of databases where you can input this data, but where are the gaps, for instance? When have certain species been recorded, and, what's the latest for that database? So it's again really difficult to exactly pinpoint what an overlooked species or overlooked ecosystem is, but it's kind of just seeing the sort of research gaps that exist and whether that research is being sort of converted into conservation practice or not, and also looking at the funding gaps that exist for those initiatives as well. And I do have to say that we do fund a lot of species work, but we are also looking at the biocultural aspect of conservation too. So some of our partners, they won't be talking about species, and they will be doing more ecosystem level work. But a lot of the work that we fund is really looking at the coming together of culture as well, cultural revival and conservation, and how both of these are not separate for Indigenous and local communities at all. They come hand in hand. So I think that is one part of the organization that really drew me to it when I was applying. Because for me, culture and conservation, identity, purpose, none of these are separate. Even just the word conservation, a lot of Indigenous, cultures, they don't see it as like a separate concept, right? It's something that is part of their being. It is part of their responsibility as humans, as stewards of the land. So it's very interesting to see how, they could be looking at conserving, species and, for instance, freshwater ecosystems that are very overlooked. But that culture is a part of it, that ancestral wisdom that has been passed down and they're safeguarding. It is all part of caring for the land.
That's really interesting. And as you were saying, I do agree with you because as you're explaining what it is that the company does, it does sound very much aligned. And like, as I've come to know you and your interests and what you want to do and achieve.
Yeah.
So I think that's really special to find a place that really, really aligns with kind of your personal values and what it is that they do as a work. So congratulations on that one.
Thank you so much.
I agree with you because I see the connection with culture, like human culture, and what it is that maybe the more Western sense of conservation, like what we mean with conservation in like the Western sense, because a lot of the conservation that we have to do is a result of what we do as humans. That
absolutely.
If we think about our own behavior and how we treat the natural resources that we have, which are not endlessly, regenerative. If we just, I mean, they are regenerative, but not as fast as we maybe would like if you consider how we treat them and our behaviors towards them. So I do think that's a very interesting angle for this organization to be taken. I think it's it's an increasingly important angle that we have to move towards. And as you said, in some places, maybe it's not as maybe your car. Sorry, I don't know. Sorry, it's like I heard the song. So where was I?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First of all, as I've mentioned,
I'm hearing like a weird sound, but okay, sorry, I was like super distracted. So yeah, I was saying about conservation and our behavior that in maybe the indigenous sense, they're saying no, it shouldn't even be conservation. Or behavior should or culture should already be accounting for maybe preserving things instead of like depleting it to the extent that now we see the negative effects and that we're running towards like conserving things. If I summarize that well.
Yes, you did. And I think it's just particularly people who live in Western countries and we're in that culture, we have this habit of separating things and to the point where we have to work in silos, right? So Western science, for instance, teaches us that if you want to look at something deeper, dissect it and separate it into like certain categories. And, one group can work on this and another group can work on that. And we can come together eventually and, have a holistic approach to the issues and concerns of our world. Knowledges that have been preserved by local and indigenous communities, and the knowledge that's even been carried forward by people of the diaspora, for instance, that knowledge teaches us that nothing is separate, right? So you don't even need to separate these things out. You don't have to put them into categories. You don't have to create those rigid sort of boundaries, right? So like, the social scientists can look at this and they can do qualitative research. And then the pure science people, they can do, they can do all the lab work and the field work. For safeguarders of this knowledge, everything is together. So you do the field work, right, together, but you also do the qualitative research. You talk to people, you ask permission from the land, you ask permission from the species when you're interacting with them. Wow. You speak a different language that is not one of, I'm going to capture you and I'm going to do all of these things and then release you again.
Mm-hmm.
It's very heart-centric, right?
Yeah.
Those decisions are made from the heart rather than the head.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why I'm so deeply inspired by the ways that Indigenous and local communities protect that knowledge, but also pass it on, not just so that knowledge stays in their communities, but also extends out to like the non-Indigenous communities as well, right? And so you're seeing certain like global platforms, for instance, like COP16 is going on right now in Colombia. There are certain spaces being provided for those voices to come across. Again, it's a very challenging space in itself because, we don't want to fall into the traps of tokenism and using these countries to just like make yourself seem you're more representative and more inclusive. Of course, that's that issue there as well. But you're seeing a lot of Indigenous peoples coming across and putting their stories forward, right? They have never seen any of this as separate. And I think it's a problem of us internalizing this sort of habit of breaking things into really, really small things and simplifying them so much that the complexity of the issue is no longer seen, right? And so then we're setting targets like 2050 and beyond, somewhere in the future, when the issues right now. Exactly. Yeah. And we can do that because we have that privilege to do that. For instance, the UK, a lot of the impacts of climate change, many of us will never really truly experience. We can say, oh my God, we're getting hotter summers and warmer winters, and perhaps that's good for us. Yay, we can go to the beach throughout the year. But we're not going to truly experience those effects. Yeah. As opposed to people who are quite literally on the front line of these impacts. They will. And so it's our privilege to say, yes, we can wait until 2030 and 2050 because those impacts are not reaching us. But it's happening right now. And we see that in the news. We hear that from family, perhaps, who are back home. They are the ones experiencing it. It's just a point of actually acknowledging that you do have that privilege. And at the same time, how have we internalized this? That, we can think about it later, as opposed to what are we doing right now?
And there's a very, and I'm going to paraphrase this because I don't remember the exact quote, but it was talking about how we are stealing the future, essentially. So we are, though it's looking at the whole broad spectrum of how the economy is structured, with taking on debts to like consume more, but that more that we are consuming is actually the resources for the future, essentially.
Absolutely.
So that kind of reminds me of that. And I was also listening to I remember I was telling you about this indigenization, which is
yes.
So I went back and found the lecture that inspired me to think more about. It was like a topic in the back of my head because as I was learning or moving more towards like the holistic and healing centric and like a decolonization, from colonial standpoints, I was like researching and looking at lectures, and there was this particular lecture that I think it was a duo. I don't know if they were husband and wife, but they were like Indigenous people from Canada, one from Canada, one from like the States, now working and living in Canada, and they were talking about this like the Indigenous versus Eurocentric standpoint, and how actually the European standpoint is seen as the only right one, like
Absolutely.
the only valid point of view, and that he said something really interesting, that from the beginning of like when the first Europeans went to discover the quote unquote New World, because it was new to them. Written in their Bibles. The Bible was only like Asia and Africa. And then it was like new to them. And because it was new to them and it wasn't written in their scriptures, which they saw as holy and like showing the way of being truth, that since they discovered them, quote unquote again, and that they discovered the Americas, it was more populous than like Europe, and that they started the question of, are these beasts? So the indigenous people, they're asking themselves if these are beasts, or if they are natural slaves, or if they are humans, or if they're peoples. And depending on what you answer in that lineup, it takes away their human rights or gives them human rights. And he said that is a question still to this day that they're asking in different ways, like the way they ask is changing, but they still have to answer that. And one of the ways, if I remember correctly, is even asking if their knowledge is valid, if the way they see the world is valid. And he was saying something, or towards the end, he was talking about some people wanting to have the government acknowledge indigenous rights. And he said, why should they acknowledge it? Because then you're giving back the power. It's just their rights as humans to have that point of view. And he didn't need them to acknowledge it as such, because then it's putting back that their point of view is kind of leading, and that they if they don't recognize something, then it's not valid. And I thought that was really interesting.
It is. Yeah. I mean, it was actually a discussion that was had in my master's, where I think there was an indigenous woman from Pakistan in the masters, and she was talking about the sort of indigenous perspective. I think I forgot exactly what the conversation was on. The module was environmental knowledges. So of course it made sense to, bring in that indigenous standpoint. And the lecturer said something like, well, we can't sort of put indigenous knowledge on a pedestal either, right? Because it's not like the ultimate knowledge, or something around those lines. And I think I just felt very uncomfortable, first of all, in that conversation. And it makes complete sense. Knowledge is not something that you swear to, like this is it and this is what I'm going to follow blindly. Knowledge is not that. It's not something that you just sort of store in a book or contain in a sort of space and you passively learn. It's something that you have to experience, you have to live through. And with every lived experience, that knowledge will shape over time, and it should do that. So no, I just think it's quite absurd and again, that lecturer was a white European woman. I just think it's absurd that for hundreds of years, this Eurocentric knowledge has been put on that pedestal. And all of a sudden now that we're talking about, bringing in alternative knowledges, we are sort of flipping that and saying, well, we can't put this knowledge on a pedestal and we can't idolize some of the concepts that come from this. And I just think it's very uncomfortable, and I don't know, it just has a bit You know, like there's also some colonial undertones to that comparison. And I think this thing of the West, and you know, if we're not going to now idolize this, let's idolize something else. Like we always have to put something on a pedestal rather than, you know, see everything as equal, perhaps.
So I'm really happy that you went to that conclusion, because that was kind of the conclusion of what they had as well. They said they're not, they don't want to put down the Eurocentric way of thinking. Exactly. They want to kind of level them and integrate, because they both have their points of views, and until we learn to integrate these different points of view, respect each other's points of view is also an important one. And have some empathy and try to understand where the other one's coming from, and then seeing, okay, where do we move on from there until we can reach that kind of consensus. We will keep going into this circle of questioning if someone has the right to their point of view or not.
Exactly.
And that's exactly kind of what you were saying with the pedestal and putting a certain way of thinking on a pedestal. Sorry. And you were talking about another point that you mentioned was like your birthland, and how that also inspired you to come to this kind of holistic and healing-centric way of thinking. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. So first of all, I just want to let the listeners know I am originally from India. I was born in New Delhi. I came to London when I was about 5. So it's been nearly 20 years that I've been on this land. And I think some of the most beautiful memories I have made so far in my life have been on that land, in New Delhi. But of course, whenever I have gone back, every single time I've gone back, so since 2005, I recently went back this year. My granddad was sort of transitioning into the ancestral world. He's no longer here with us. But every single time I've gone back, I've realized that, okay, I'm not from here. I am not from here. Even though the culture of India, the knowledge, like the Vedic knowledge, and certain practices that we use, for instance, oiling our hair, and using certain herbs to sort of, make ourselves feel better when we're ill, things like that, very small things. Everything about me is Indian in my eyes. But whenever I have gone back, I've thought, well, I'm not from here. And I do call London home. But at the same time, I do feel that I am also not from here. And I think a lot of immigrants will feel that, particularly children of immigrants, but also children who are immigrants themselves, right? So you can have like first and second generation people who say, no, well, London is home or the UK is home. But for me, it's quite difficult because all of my first memories are made in India. So I think it's difficult. And so when we were talking about re-indigenization, a bit of a long word.
Yes.
I did straight away tell you, well, I don't want to co-opt in any way, right? Because co-optation is something I'm very, very sensitive about and very aware of, even though a lot of people will say, well, you aren't even born here. So perhaps, you can have a say in the sort of space. And I still do see myself as non-Indigenous because, again, like I said, I'm not from India anymore, and I've been living here for nearly 20 years, but I still don't think I'm Indigenous. And I think it becomes even more difficult when you are living in a city that is a cosmopolitan city, right? London is extremely diverse. People are coming and going. A lot is happening here. There's a lot of different sort of viewpoints and cultures that come into this space, to the point where I don't think anyone can say from London that, I'm Indigenous to London. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's such a global city. And I was also born in a metropolitan city in New Delhi, which doesn't fall in any of the Indian states. It's just, you have that city and people are coming from different states, and eventually you will see like the sort of style of cooking, for instance. It's very blended. There's like fusion within within a country in itself. India is just so big, and the amount of culture and the languages is very rich. But when you come from a city and then you've moved to a city where the concept of indigeneity just doesn't exist because it's just so globalized, I think it becomes even more difficult. And so I was like, I don't know if I can speak to this when you did mention it before doing this episode. But what I can speak to is, I guess, questioning, challenging the sort of Western understanding of what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to be Indigenous to place. So the first thing that perhaps we would do, and I'm also guilty of it, is trying to trace back people's ancestry to see whether or not they're actually Indigenous or not. Yeah. Right? So how many generations back can you trace for people of the land? Like, have your grandparents also been here? Have your great-grandparents also been here? Perhaps if they have, then you can be considered Indigenous. Yeah. And I definitely, that's perhaps how I, have decided for myself that, I'm not Indigenous to this place because, I wasn't even born here. My parents weren't born in London, and therefore it means, that I'm not. But then when I think about my own ancestry, so I was born in New Delhi, so was my sister. My parents were as well. But my grandparents are from the state of Uttarakhand. So there's a region called Garhwal. It's in the Indian part of the Himalayas. So they're from there. And I've never been to that part. My dad went recently to honor the ancestral land when his dad passed away. But I haven't personally been there. And yet mountain landscapes are landscapes that are extremely close to my heart, is because I am a Pahari. A Pahari means a person of the Himalayan mountains, right, in Hindi. So whenever we do go to mountains as a family, my dad's always like, us Pahari people, we're here, we're in our element. You do feel just so alive. There's certain sorts of landscapes I just feel extremely alive in. One is the beach, but one is also the mountain. And I genuinely, when I feel the wind in my hair and I can hear the sounds of the birds and sort of sometimes even feeling like the rugged landscape. So let's say if it's a very steep way up and you're sort of climbing your way through, just those textures, those sensations, it really helps me connect back to the homeland that I've never been a part of. Yeah. And so for someone who is not Indigenous to any place, I think for me, it just is sort of tapping into that ancestral knowledge that we all have, right? And really feeling guided by those who have walked before us, those who are here to guide us, whether they are, immediately related to you, like your human ancestors, or whether it's the more than human ancestors. It's sort of stepping back and thinking, well, what does my intuition that has been gifted by the ancestors, what does that say? Right? And a big part of what I'm sort of looking into now is seeing how you are placed within the ecosystem. And the ancestral world is intimately connected to the world right here on Earth. Yeah. And so even if you struggle to find where exactly you are, where do you belong, that guiding is always there. That guidance is always there. And so I'm, again, like I said, I'm very careful when I talk about, what it means to be Indigenous, because I don't know that.
Yeah.
But when I connect to a land that I have never walked on in this body, I am connecting to the bodies that I have lived through in previous lives, right? And the knowledge that I've received through them. And I just think it's amazing, because so I'm a Hindu. I follow Hinduism.
Mm-hmm.
And reincarnation is a big part of it. And, we have this cycle of life. And, we're taught that if you're a human right now, perhaps you're a cat before, or a tree, or a bird. And all of those knowledges of those bodies are stored within. It's just a matter of tapping into that. So even if you are not Indigenous to anywhere, and you have moved around so much that you struggle to find your place in the world, for me, it's just really tapping in to that ancestral wisdom. And it can be difficult, right, living in Western culture.
Yeah.
But it's something I just really wanted to share.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing. I was thinking that is indeed, if we started off talking about like science, this is one of those things that science kind of like, I don't want to say goes against, but because it can't be like tangibly proven.
Exactly.
It's one of those things that they're more skeptical of, maybe.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think there are certain scientific principles or sections that are more and more, as the more they search, the more they go towards, there might be something
exactly
maybe what their own scientific ancestors would have called woo, or contested in some way that because it can't be proven, it's not true. That they are that same scientific I forget the discipline. Yeah, the scientific discipline is going towards like they're more like, well, yeah, there is something there. Maybe what I do agree with is that I'm like, we can't. None of us have actually. Maybe we do come from source or universe or God or whatever you want to call it, but none of us have that memory of, oh, it's exactly like this, and
exactly,
it is a he, or it is a she, or none of us have that memory in that way that we can say it's for certain. I can agree with them that is true. We can't say for certain, but what I personally have found works for me yes, and that's kind of the point of view that I've adopted is whatever works for you, as long as it doesn't impose on another, as long as it doesn't take the right of others away, and you don't say that this is the only truth, then I'm okay with whatever you believe in, because none of us can say for certain it is this exact way or not.
Exactly.
But I found it, like, I was raised Catholic myself, but I started questioning very, very young. I was questioning things, and people were saying, no, this is the law of the Bible or whatever. And I'm like, but if this, then that, and then it doesn't make sense in that way. And, like,
exactly.
Not very welcome train of thoughts for someone being raised religious in general, or in most religions. It's not very welcome to question things in that way.
Exactly.
But for me, what works is I love learning about all of these different religions and practices. And a lot of times you will find there's a lot more like similarities than there are differences. But I think we get stuck a lot on terminology and no, it is this word, no, it's called this or it's called that. And I'm like, but it's the same thing at the end of the day. So it doesn't matter, like I'm sitting in a chair. It would be the English word, but then in Dutch it would be stoel, but it's the same thing at the end of the day.
Exactly. It serves the same purpose.
Yeah.
And, for instance, when there's a lot of cultures and religions who worship the moon and the sun, we'll have different names for it, but at the end of the day, they're still the same, right? The sun is the sun, the moon is the moon. And there's different practices to worship them and revere them, but they're quite literally the same, the same celestial body. And I think it's this obsession in the West of you need to have evidence, and the evidence needs to look a certain way that really limits us from opening up to different beliefs and to different faiths and different ways of understanding. And again, it's a very colonial sort of mindset, right? That data and like quantitative data is the sort of, that's the only way we can store information and do something about it. For instance, lots of people think that intelligence is based off of how you perform in STEM subjects as opposed to the arts. And it's quite literally that, right?
This quote, sorry to interrupt you, like this quote, like, if you're measuring the intelligence of a fish and how well it can climb a tree, then of course.
Yes, the classic one. Absolutely, the classic one. I love that. Exactly. But then when, we're talking about stories and how traditions are being orally passed down, how those have shaped societies, how that helps us retain humanity and what it means to be alive as a human, as an interconnected being. None of that matters, right? Because that's not something that can be quantified. That's not something that can be profited from necessarily. I guess now, people can pretend, for instance, they're Indigenous or, sort of just to access certain spaces or to co-opt a certain identity or set of beliefs. It's crazy, but, it's not something that can still be, I guess, monetized, and it can't be even controlled. I think a lot of religions and why so many people just feel so disconnected from religions is that they're just extremely dogmatic. You can't question them. There's a certain set of beliefs that needs to be applied to every single region. Whereas our sort of what I call pre-colonial ancestors, which again is a very difficult phrase in itself. Like, what do I mean by that? They would invite that fluidity, and you don't have to follow something in a certain way to identify as that thing. You don't have to, because there's just so much variety and diversity within countries and even within like cities and regions. Every single community will have their own way of understanding what has been taught to them. And that knowledge is supposed to be transformed in that way and developed in that way over time. And I think what I really love is a lot of Indigenous peoples, they see knowledge as a living, breathing entity of itself that has to be preserved to, help it survive. And that's what the whole cultural revival thing is all about, right? It's to quite literally keep this knowledge alive. How do we do that? And it's through accepting that there are so many different ways of doing that, that you don't have to have sort of rules set in stone that you have to go by. And I think that's where a lot of religions just fall through, because they don't invite that fluidity.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I have this issue. Like, I do live in a very religious society and such, and it's predominantly Christian before Catholic, but now you have like different sections of Christianity, different I think it's denominations that they call them. And I do struggle with that sometimes, because you have people that are really hanging on to that dogma and that only see other Christian peoples as valid. And they don't directly say it like that, but it's like they introduce, let's say it's three people, and they are introducing one to the other, and they have to point out, oh, they're also a Christian. And I'm like, why? why is that like the first thing out of your mouth? Because that person has so much more rich history than just being a Christian. So why is that the first thing, and why is that the most important? And I kind of like analyze that more. It's like, because the point of view of that person is the validity of being Christian, that in being a Christian you're more important, or as they say, I'm a child of God. And I'm like, but if you're if I follow your scripture right to a point, that isn't that mean that we're all supposed to be a child of, and why you're making the distinction? Is it because the other person is not Christian that you think they're not a child of what you call God? Or it's an interesting pet peeve and side quest of mine to analyze.
Absolutely. And I just think a lot of religious systems have really internalized, colonial practices of everyone needs to be the same. It's really creating these monocultures within human society. It's just really, really terrifying, because when you do that, it's easier to control people, as opposed to a place where it's so diverse and people, are really acting on their agency and their intuition and their ancestral wisdom. That it's difficult to then control people like that, as opposed to people who you've really just kind of made the same, homogenized their group. And it's just very easy to control them, because they don't have, or at least they're not allowed to have, those individual views and opinions of their own. And again, if you look at the sort of people that are leading those religious spaces, they'll usually be men, right? They'll have a lot of money and power, and their beliefs are actually not religious. It's just them using that religion to control.
It's very controlling, and as you said, like the making people homogenous. It's something that you see a lot in like the dystopian sci-fi.
Yes, absolutely.
Everything's the same color. Everybody has to, walk the same way, think the same way, and I think that's it's maybe a shock factor, an extreme way of showing it. But in some ways it is like that. Because if I don't think the same as you, or if I don't believe the scripture, if I don't sometimes even within the same church, if I don't interpret the scripture the same as you, then there's...
absolutely.
I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking, of seeing the world, because the more we accept, again, going back to the different points of views, that maybe you read the same thing, but you interpreted the same thing the different way. And instead of analyzing that, well, why did you interpret it that way? What does it mean for you? And is there something that I can learn from that? Instead of doing that, just doubling down. Like, I think it's a very fragile point of view as well, because that means that you are not so strong in your beliefs, that when I interpret something slightly different, that kind of pokes at your belief, and that you have to protect it in such a way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm just saying that, recognizing it from myself, that it's like maybe even a cognitive dissonance, which is also an important aspect of it, is that, but if you interpret it a certain way, that means that it poked a hole into my belief. And if it pokes a hole in my belief, I can't have that. It's damaging for my self view. So I will like double down and defend it in such a way that guy, just to hold my way of thinking. Then yeah, I think that's a lot of what's going on in the world, that people are either protecting their own interests, and their own interest can be their own self-view, in a sense. And yeah, I often ask my colleague, like, yeah, but how do you change that? That's like my mind. It's like, how do you can't go up to these people and say like, you're weak and your beliefs are weak, and you're that because
Yeah.
you're trying to protect your inner self, and have a whole psychological evaluation with them. They will change, because that's not going to work, obviously. That wouldn't work on me if I was in that position either. So but I am very interested in like behavioral change, and how
Yes.
we can like shift the paradigm, so people do kind of have a more critical standpoint on themselves, that can kind of like self-evaluate. Well, why do I think like that? And am I indoctrinated with certain points of view? That's obviously a very natural state for myself, and I think you would have a similar state. Otherwise, you wouldn't like
Be here. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's a very good way of being, because you're constantly engaging with your environment and yourself, and did I interpret it that way, or am I seeing through a particular lens? And I think if more people had this kind of discernment, that we would have this kind of holistic world. Yeah, I don't want to say sooner, but it will get us closer to that kind of like holistic world and holistic society, and that more of us are kind of engaging with the world in this way. So yeah, I did write down shifting the paradigm. So I'll throw that ball to you. How do you think we can kind of like change the behaviors towards ourselves and other people and the environment, which I think is at the core of this whole separation of things, putting them in different categories, and like entrapping them in that way, which is causing a lot of issues at the end of the day, because we're not seeing how that, for example, that economic interest of yours is damaging the environment. And I have very interesting example that I learned yesterday. You have here a restaurant that is owned by a local person that has a pier. I won't name names, but like if it's a local person, they'll know. They have a pier, and they extended the pier. And they, before, many years ago, I want to say even maybe 10, 12 years ago, there was a protest to extend that pier. But recently they got their way, and they have a natural conservation organization that told them, well, if you change the design slightly, you will avoid destroying this. There was this coral that was the only of its kind left here. That if they change the design differently, they could have avoided destroying this coral, and they could have even said, well, we adapt. You could have used that as your marketing,
Absolutely. Oh my God.
It's back to your money, which is what was most important. But they decided on the design as it was, and which meant it would destroy this coral, because otherwise they would be missing 2 tables on their pier. Yeah.
And it went through? It went through?
Yeah, it's built. The coral is dead, basically. Yeah, we have like coral conservation initiatives that try to like reestablish it in different places. Like they cut it up, dissect it, and it didn't like that. It was too much stress, so it died. All of it died. Yeah. So it is a very interesting thing, like how do you change, especially these people's perception, because they are the ones with like money and a lot of economic interests, but they're not seeing, when they talk about balance, then they're not talking about balance of like the ecological, social impact that their economic interest has, but they're talking more of the economic impact that the social and environmental interest has on their interest. So I'm very I always think like, how do we shift this paradigm? Is it even possible? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I just want to hold some space for the coral, to sort of grieve for it. It's just really, really disturbing and really heartbreaking to hear that, when there's so many alternatives and there are actual like organizations, conservation organizations providing you with those alternatives, right? And there being an opportunity to sort of profit off of, oh, look, I'm ecologically, aware, and I'm environmentally friendly. And even then going through and destroying that.
Yeah.
So I really just want to hold space for that coral and for every other, all the beings that really depended on that, that ecosystem. So it's something that I actually talked about with one of the guests on my podcast, Camille Sapara Barton, on how conscious level, or sort of philosophical level change is what we both, of course, feel aligned to, and we do as well. But it's not necessarily something that everyone thinks is important, right? So a lot of people think, yeah, we can have, for example, the conversation we're having today, and we can talk to people, and we can go to therapy or to be in some sort of circle that is allowing us to process some of our traumas that we project out into the world. Yeah. But policy level change is what we need to focus on. Like, this is a waste of time and blah, blah, blah. And again, it's not a way to sort of put down people's understanding of change making. But for me, this makes sense. So having conversations like this, is this having a direct impact on things like, preserving coral that is going to be killed? No. But if we don't have these conversations, who's going to be a part of that change making? That change making that needs to happen from the grassroots. And yes, and like in this case, it fell through, but it was still there. That hope, that resistance.
Yeah.
That movement was there. And so even though the desired results didn't come through, they will eventually. And the land and the waters and the coral itself, now it's, part of the ancestral world, they knew what those people done for it. And even though if they weren't able to help it survive, that gratitude will come back. Right. And again, this is very emotional, and sometimes people think this is a bit silly. But this is where the actual change making happens. And for me, it makes complete sense to talk about how we as humans understand the world. Yeah. Right. And this is why I talk about the more than human, because I do feel that they are more than the human, which again, some people think, well, then you're putting them on a pedestal. It was never a question about that. If we have dominated this world for as long as we've been here, right, we've always been trying to assert our dominance. We've created this world that is separate from the natural world, right? The infrastructure, the civilization itself. We've grown in a way that we feel proud that, this is our world, and whenever we want to, we'll just go for a little hike, we'll go to the park, or we'll, bring home animals into the house that are pets. Like, then we feel good about ourselves. But at the end of the day, we're all hurting in the inside. We are all very, very damaged, which sounds very pessimistic, but there's a lot of fractures within ourselves. There's a lot of ruptures. A lot of disconnections. It is so unnatural for us to see ourselves as dominant to the natural world. And so, when you're talking about like, how do we talk to these people in power? First of all, we can't, because they've created these walls around themselves, and that's not our responsibility necessarily to break them down. Yeah. But it's also this understanding that no one is born wanting to dominate, right? No one is born with this desire that, when I get older, like as a baby, when you're born, you're not born with this desire that when I get older, I'm going to control people and manipulate people and destroy people's lives who I see as inferior to myself. It's things that you learn, right? And so when these like companies, and they decide to not listen to the locals, they decide to not listen to conservation organizations, and they're silent about it, that's their intuition telling them that they're doing something wrong. But they're still choosing to go against it. And even though they might not show it, somewhere deep down, their bodies will be like, what are you doing? This is extremely unnatural. But they're going to go for what is going to give them joy and power, which sounds really horrific to be using that word. But that what is going to quench their thirst for power right now, instead of what is actually going to be nourishing for my body and for my community that I'm part of, but also communities that really depend on this land, who had that connection to the coral, for instance, who are fighting for this every single day. So first of all, it's just understanding that inherently humans are not horrible. We're not horrible, even though it seems very difficult to accept that. Are we sure? Other animals haven't been, other mammals haven't been able to do what we are doing. So first of all, it's understanding that inherently we're not the bad ones here. We're not the villains here. And that's kind of where I look towards ancestral ways of storytelling. There's not one villain of the story, and there's also not one hero. And I take deep inspiration from Hinduism and the sort of stories that we tell, because the sort of protagonists, they will have massive flaws in them. And then you will see that at the end of the day, them being like the hero, they might win, but they would have lost a lot because of the sort of, decisions that they made along the way. So stories in that way are very cyclical. There's not one person that's completely in the wrong, and there's not one person that's completely in the right either. So it is a way of sort of learning, but also unlearning. And understanding that, you might not be able to reach those certain levels of power because they've created those walls around them and they really just don't want to associate. But then how can we replenish the sort of pockets of hope that we've created within our communities that can allow us to pass through this chaos? Yeah. Because I know this sounds extremely pessimistic, but we do know where we're heading. We're heading for destruction, regardless of what we do. We've gone past that point of going back to a time that, everyone was respected, ecosystems were protected. The damage is devastating, and it's critical, and it's something that you can't sort of completely heal. That is for sure. But how can we get through all of this and be hopeful, right? That even though we know what the end is, we can still work together to heal things in us that can then help us heal as much as we can in like our external landscapes. So for me, that change has to come from within. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. And it's why I started the podcast and why I'm here with you today and why I love engaging in these conversations. Because when you actually sit down and talk to people and you see, you know, the sort of childhood traumas that they've had, the sort of relationships that they had with their parents, their grandparents, their siblings, and you see a lot of disconnections in that, right? A lot of breakages. And then you see how they interact with other people, how they see people that, or communities that are not human, you know, and how they decide to sort of pursue a career, what they decide to pursue a career. And it all really comes back down to, well, what have you been through as a child? Yeah. And, you know, if you actually look at these people in power, they've had horrible childhoods, right? There's a lot of things there that they haven't been able to process. And so for me, a lot of work, and it's something that I talk about a lot in the podcast, is really just coming back to the body, and being in tune with the body being an ecosystem in itself, right? There's so many different systems here that are really working together to keep us alive. But there are also people who have walked before us, our ancestors, who, because of what they done and their resilience, we are here. Me and you wouldn't have been here today without them, without our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors, right? So I think the real change happens when you sort of see your body itself as a system and work on the sort of things that you've internalized and how you control certain parts or your entire body, right? For us to actually make sense of the systems that we live in. Yeah. And it requires a lot of work, but vulnerability and honesty are like core sort of pillars of that work. Like without that, you can't accept that, yeah, there are flaws in you as well, that you do see certain things a certain way and you need to change that. But that change, again, only happens in community. When you actually find those spaces where you feel valued, where you feel respected, where you feel that, yeah, there is hope. We know what the end will look like, perhaps, but we need to focus on the now.
Yeah.
Right. And having these conversations, they might not have a direct impact on protecting some of the most, you know, vulnerable species and habitats, but it's starting somewhere. And again, like I said, right, the land will reciprocate that.
Yeah.
The coral will reciprocate that.
Yeah, I agree with that, because despite of like the horror stories that we have here about how like the economic interest in like tourism is damaging our nature, and the funny thing is the tourist corporation has a slogan now: "It's in our nature."
Oh,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I really right. So,
yeah.
Despite that, I am grateful that we do have like this nature conservation that has done a lot. And if we see the destruction of our island compared to other islands that have not been as fortunate to have such an organization, that we do still have a nature to fight for in that sense. I am grateful for that. And
exactly.
You're right, and holding space and having other organizations, like you have a Greenpeace here that started like so they're taking the Dutch government to court for not protecting us enough. As a, like, you have the Netherlands that is like super industrialized in a sense, and their amounts of people and their amounts of industrialization is part of or having a much bigger effect on climate change than us as a tiny island, and us being within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So that is the ground of the tiny island suing kind of like the mainland in that sense. Just like in a colonial sense, but for now it's kind of like that idea that they are in a sense, you came here, you conquered the land in a sense, and you did benefit economically from the land and from the people that you took from Africa and brought here, and now you are enjoying those benefits, that luxury of having certain economic benefits, and those economic benefits and luxury are then causing a problem with the climate that is now disproportionately affecting us because we are in the global south. So that's kind of like that point of view that they are coming with this case against the government. And I think that's one of those things that is creating space and creating conversation of this nature, as you were saying. And they're even having like conversations under the tamarind tree, which is like about climate change and what we can do. And I think an important part will be for us adaptation. How will we adapt, and how can we still preserve what we do have? And I hope that with that preservation that we can have in the future, as you said, some kind of healing. It won't be the same. Definitely not.
Absolutely.
So we have to kind of preserve what we still have, so it doesn't have the same fate as what has already gone. And maybe in the spaces where things have already disappeared, that we can kind of like try to get a new ecosystem going, which won't be the same ecosystem as before, but it will still be more than nothing. In that sense.
Exactly.
So I think that conversation is very important around this. And I think we're going towards closing up our conversation. We can talk about this all day, but that's not
absolutely.
But maybe in another episode. But for now, I as you mentioned, the incorporating of our body and the kind of, I think, our nervous system regulation is a very important part of it. I think that is why you want the healing, essentially, because something like trauma and like post-traumatic syndromes we have different types, but these kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome that is brought on by trauma is felt within our bodies, and we hold a lot of our traumas within our bodies. And I asked you to do a breathing practice at the end of this, so that's the bridge I was trying to build there.
Absolutely.
Breathing practice as a closing, because I wanted my listeners to experience it. And we chose to do it at the end because we had to kind of like bring in the premise of why we do this and why we find it important to incorporate also how you feel within your body with the work that you do, because I think it's important. And I think if our leaders that we were talking about do some breathing practices before going into we will have better outcomes.
Absolutely. I think it could. I think it would. Not even could. I definitely think it would.
Yeah.
Really allowing yourself to, before going into like a decision-making space, step back before opening the doors, right? Step back and actually take those deep breaths. And wow, just that small practice could transform everything. But yeah, thank you so much for like building that bridge. I think it like perfectly flows into this space now. But yeah, just to let your listeners know, I usually begin every episode in this way. So I think this is really interesting to be bringing a conversation to a close with this grounding. But for me, yeah, as I mentioned, the body in itself is really, really important. And if we are doing this work, it needs to be place-based. And what is more powerful than the place of the body, right? And how it helps you, be grounded and to be present in the moment. So that is exactly what we're going to be doing now. But before we do begin, I would just like to ground this practice in itself with a remembrance of the ancestors. And it's something that we've talked about. But before even joining today, before hitting record, I was thinking, I really do want to ground this practice and in honor of the ancestors. So before we begin, it would be great if you could just think of an ancestor you would want to connect to in this space. It could be a grandparent, for instance. It could be a human ancestor. It could be the more than human ancestors. Really just choosing anyone for now. Not putting too much thought into it, because we are going to, again, bring that attention back to the breathing and the body. But it's just really to honor the ancestors and for what they've done for us to be here present today in this conversation. So with that remembering, I would like for us to just close our eyes and really just thinking about that particular ancestor that you feel you've been building a really deep connection to recently, perhaps. And really just feeling grateful that whatever they had done, because of that, we are here today. And we are able to provide ourselves with this space of bringing back that attention and that love and that care to the body. And that has been possible because of them. And because of their resilience and their hope that one day the future generation will be looking back and just really feeling grateful for the work that they've done. So we were talking a bit about the trapping of trauma and pain in the body. And so this exercise, although breathing is the main part of it, bringing that attention to the breath, I would just like for us to gradually sort of get ourselves really relaxed in the space that we're in right now. So let's just start off with our shoulders. We're just going to create some shoulder circles. Try to make them as big as possible and really feel that stretch starting from the back. So really moving those shoulders up and back, creating really big circles. If there's any tension stored here, just really allowing that to release. Okay, and then you can bring those forward, those circles forward. Really feeling that stretch. And again, keeping that gratitude in mind. Now let's move to the neck and the head, creating, again, gentle head circles, moving first to the left. And again, feeling that stretch, feeling grateful that we are able to provide this time to the body. And again, being mindful of perhaps any tensions stored here. Okay, and then we're just going to take that on the other side. Again, you can create half circles here or full ones. It's really up to you. Really just, how you're feeling right now, how the body's feeling right now. Now let's flow the attention down to our stomachs. I do feel that a lot of tension does get stored here, and just from conversation with different people, I noticed that that is a common sort of feeling, the storing of trauma and pain in the stomach. So for this, I would really like us to just place a hand or both hands, if you're able to, on our tummies. And then just taking deep breaths here. We will take guided deep breaths together, but just allowing for ourselves to feel that expansion and contraction as we're taking those deep breaths. Again, the hands on our tummies is just for us to feel that and just to reassure ourselves that everything will be okay. We can get through this if we just prioritize ourselves and people that we love, the people that we know, but also the people that we don't know. But in some ways we do know because we share vulnerabilities. We all store our pain in our bodies, and we can get through this together. Now let's move the attention down to the legs. Again, you can place your hands on your thighs. You can kind of stroke them to let yourself really know that everything is okay. This moment is really holding us here and comforting us as we're allowing ourselves to slow down. Again, you can, if you want, move your legs a little bit, your feet, your toes. Just everything that you're doing, do so with that intention of relaxing the body, releasing it from tension, releasing it from any locked positions it's been throughout the day. Even in this conversation, perhaps if we were entering certain spaces that were difficult for you to process, or allowed you to think a bit more deeply, this space is just for us to relax. Of course, being aware that right now, someone, somewhere, the communities are experiencing a lot of pain and violence. But if we are giving this time to ourselves, it is sort of pushing that energy out into the world. I really need it. I really, really needs it. Again, it's about reciprocation. If we are holding this time for ourselves, then, everyone else will also get that time. It's that hope that we can create together. So now we're just going to take a few deep breaths together. And I just want us, when we're doing this, to make our breaths as deep and as rich as we possibly can. Really feeling when you're drawing in that breath, feeling your body rising, and then making that release as long as possible as well. And again, just really noticing the sensation of that. And really feeling that breath going into you and then coming out. Okay, so we're going to be doing 5 deep breaths together. The first deep breath, take a big deep breath in. Really allow the body to rise. Again, you can focus on a particular part of your body, like the top of your head, your back, anything that allows you to feel that expansion, and release. Again, noticing how the body responds to that with the breath in and the breath out. Take a deep breath in. And a deep breath out. Take a deep breath in. And a deep breath out. Take a deep breath in. Now we go back to straighten here. Allow your head to rise a bit and release that. Allow your body to come to something that's a bit more relaxed. Soften the body here. We're going to take our last deep breath together for this practice. Try to make this as deep and as rich as possible. Really feeling in your body. Take a deep breath in. And a deep breath out. Now, before we end today's practice, I would just want us to pay our respects to the ancestors once again, expressing that gratitude that we had at the beginning of the practice, thanking them for everything that they've done to provide us with this life that we have today. And just being open to their guidance, being ready to tap into that intuition, the ancestral wisdom, and being open to learning from each other and from those that perhaps we didn't consider ancestors before, but they were always here to guide us and protect us and support us. With this gratitude, we can gently open our eyes.
Yeah, it happens when you're like stretching and relaxing that your eyes start watering.
Absolutely, I get that all the time. And this is, I guess, and I guess this is that release, right? This is exactly that release. For you, it's tears. For someone else, it's like really just allowing that stretch to come through. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for guiding us through that breathing practice. I don't know about our audience, but I feel very, very relaxed.
Perfect.
Good at that. I was thinking like if she had some kind of like recordings to help you relax, I would totally be your first customer.
Oh, amazing. Perhaps that's another source of income.
Yeah, that's another yes. Thinking that we do live in this capitalistic world. We need to make money somehow, right?
But thank you so much. Seriously, Monarch, I am very, very grateful to have met you and gotten to know you, even though I feel like there's so much more, of getting to know each other. But I feel like this connection is very, very strong. And hopefully, if the, universe provides that space for us to finally meet in person, I would absolutely love that.
Nice.
Yeah, but I'm very, very grateful. You've come onto my show 2 times now and created absolutely beautiful episodes. Every single time, we've talked and thought about co-creating something, I've just always felt so at ease that, it will happen. Like whatever comes out of this space will be absolutely beautiful. So thank you so much for being the person that you are and for the amazing work that you're doing with Kreashon. I'm so happy you're back into the podcasting space. Yeah, and I'm very, very honored to be, a part of that comeback for you. So thank you so much. It was absolutely amazing.
For actually being the one to first contact me. So I also very much appreciate that and appreciate having this connection with you, and that we can bond over what we studied, in a conventional way, in environmentalism and like international development, and that we've both come to this conclusion about it has to be holistic. Otherwise, the work is, for me, it's kind of pointless to try and put a band-aid on when what we have to do is really go deep and do some operations and make it like heal properly. And that has to happen in a holistic way, and we have to start combining the different points of views and knowledge, and to get there. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that space with me. And yeah, I do feel very, very privileged. I started from us, or from me being on your podcast. I started holding space for recognition of the privilege we have to sit here and have this conversation when we know all of the things that are going on around the world. And I do think it's important as well to hold that space and to think of those people as well, and hope that they too one day can have this relaxed state and not be in survivalism, and have the privilege of just living their lives and letting their voice be heard. And I think I don't want to speak for you, but I think you will be equally as happy as me to hear their voices and hear their points of views when the time is there. So yeah, thank you for that. And I want to thank anyone that took the time to listen to us, and our point of view. Even maybe sometimes you don't agree with everything we said, but I do hope that you can also hold space for our point of view, and hopefully start seeing that things are so fragmented that we have to start seeing everything as a whole, be it economic, environmental, social. It has to come together. Otherwise, it won't work, and we will head towards utter destruction in that sense. And we're just hoping to minimize the destruction as much as possible with our work. So thank you so much for listening. Until next time on the Kreashon podcast. Bye.
Bye.